The Villarni were running out of time, and everyone in the galaxy knew it. Their species had once spread across dozens of worlds, billions strong, with a civilization that stretched back 10,000 years. Now they were barely hanging on. The problem was not war or disease. It was something far stranger and more terrifying. Their children had stopped learning. Commander Zeethkor stood in his office aboard the diplomatic ship Harmonious Dawn, staring at a report he had read 100 times already. The numbers were clear. In the last 5 years, not a single cub had completed basic training. Not one. The young Villarni would sit in their training halls silent and still, refusing to engage with even the most experienced teachers. Without proper education, these cubs would grow into dysfunctional adults, unable to live in Villarni society. The species was dying from the inside out. The Galactic Council had suggested bringing in outside help. Zeethkor hated the idea. His people had survived for millennia without needing assistance from other species. But pride meant nothing if there were no cubs left to carry on their traditions. So he had agreed to meet with a consultant from Earth, one of the newer species to join the galactic community. Humans had only been traveling through space for 30 years. What could they possibly know about raising Villarni cubs? The human arrived on a small transport ship, carrying only a single bag. His name was Daniel Price, and his file said he worked with something called behavioral psychology and childhood education. Zeethkor did not understand half the terms in the human's credentials. Daniel was a man of medium height with graying hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. He wore simple clothes that looked nothing like proper diplomatic attire. When Daniel entered the office, he extended his hand in the human greeting gesture. Zeethkor had read about this custom but found it strange. He did not take the offered hand. The human did not seem offended. He simply lowered his arm and smiled that easy smile. "Commander Zeethkor," Daniel said, "thank you for having me. I know this situation must be incredibly difficult for your people." Zeethkor's ears flattened against his skull, a sign of irritation among his kind. "Difficult is an understatement, human. Our finest educators cannot reach the cubs. Our most skilled pack leaders have tried and failed. Even our alphas, those who command absolute respect in our society, cannot make the cubs respond. Tell me, what makes you think you can do better?" Daniel pulled out a small device and scrolled through some information. "I read all the reports during my journey here. I have some theories, but I need to see the cubs in person before I can say anything definitive. If you will allow me to observe them, I believe I can help." The Villarni commander's tail twitched with frustration. Everything about this human seemed too casual, too relaxed. This was a crisis that threatened an entire species, and Daniel acted as if he were discussing the weather. But desperation made for strange alliances. The council had recommended this human specifically, and Zeethkor had no better options. "Very well," he said finally. "I will take you to our primary training facility on Valar Prime, our home world. You can observe the cubs there. But I want you to understand something, human. We have tried everything. Our people have spent years searching for a solution. Experts from 3 different species have examined the cubs and found nothing wrong with them physically. If you cannot help us, then I do not know what we will do." The weight of those words hung in the air. Daniel's expression became more serious. "I understand, Commander. I will do everything in my power to figure this out. Sometimes an outside perspective is exactly what is needed to see a problem clearly." The journey to Valar Prime took 6 hours. During that time, Daniel asked Zeethkor hundreds of questions about Villarni culture, society, and child-rearing practices. The commander found himself explaining things he had never really thought about before. How their society was organized into packs with strict hierarchies. How every Villarni knew their place and their role from a young age. How cubs were trained in groups, learning to work together and follow the guidance of their elders and pack leaders. Daniel listened carefully to everything, taking notes and asking follow-up questions. Some of his questions seemed odd to Zeethkor. The human wanted to know if cubs ever played without adult supervision. He asked about how much choice cubs had in their daily activities. He inquired about what happened when a cub refused to follow instructions in the old days, before this crisis began. When they finally landed on Valar Prime, Zeethkor felt a familiar heaviness settle over him. This was his homeworld, the planet where he had been born and raised. It should have been a place of joy and life. Instead, it felt like a world preparing for its own end. They traveled to the central training facility, a massive complex that could house and educate 300 cubs at once. The facility director, an alpha named Krelvar, met them at the entrance. Krelvar was huge even by Valarni standards, his dark fur marked with scars from the leadership challenges he had won over the years. His presence commanded immediate respect. When he spoke, others listened. But even Krelvar looked tired, defeated in a way that shocked Zaithkor to see. "Commander," Krelvar said, nodding respectfully. His eyes moved to Daniel and his ears pulled back slightly. "This is the human consultant?" "I am Daniel Price," the human said, offering his hand again. This time Krelvar did take it, though the gesture looked awkward with his large paw engulfing the human's smaller hand. "Come," Krelvar said. "I will show you what we face every day." They walked through long corridors with windows looking down into training rooms. In each room, cubs sat in perfect rows. They were beautiful young creatures, their fur still showing the softer colors of youth. Some had spots, others had stripes, each pattern unique. They sat perfectly still, their eyes open but empty. Adult instructors moved among them, trying to coax responses, attempting to start lessons, offering encouragement. The cubs did not react. They did not move. They barely seemed to breathe. Daniel stopped at one window, watching intently. In the room below, a female instructor named Cyranelle was working with a group of 20 cubs. She held up colorful objects, trying to teach them shapes and colors. She spoke in a gentle voice, her body language submissive and encouraging. The cubs stared straight ahead as if she did not exist. "How long has this been happening?" Daniel asked quietly. Krelvar's voice was heavy with pain. "It started small about 12 years ago. Cubs needed more repetition to learn things. They seemed distracted, less engaged. We thought perhaps we needed to adjust our teaching methods, make them more interesting. But year by year it grew worse. 5 years ago it reached this point, complete shutdown. They eat when we give them food. They sleep when we dim the lights. But they do not learn. They do not play. They do not make sounds or show any interest in the world around them." Daniel watched for several more minutes in silence. Then he asked, "Can anyone make them respond? Has anyone had even small success?" Zaithkor and Krelvar exchanged glances. "No one," the Alpha said. "I will show you." They descended to the training arena, a large open space where cubs learned physical skills. 50 cubs sat in rows on the floor. 3 instructors stood before them, looking exhausted and hopeless. When Krelvar entered, the instructors immediately stepped back, making way for the Alpha. Krelvar walked to the center of the arena. His presence was impressive, commanding. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of voice that had led packs through countless challenges. "Cubs of Valar Prime," he announced. "It is time for movement training. Stand and form pairs as you have been taught." Nothing happened. Not one cub moved. Not one ear twitched. Krelvar tried again, his voice harder now, the tone of an alpha who expected obedience. "I am Alpha Krelvar, leader of the Northern Packs. You will obey this command. Stand now and form pairs." The cubs remained motionless, as if carved from stone. Krelvar stood there for a long moment, and Daniel saw something flicker across the Alpha's face. Pain, defeat, helplessness. For someone who had never failed at anything, who had commanded respect his entire life. This was devastating. Krelvar turned and walked out of the arena without another word. The instructors looked at Daniel and Zaithkor with empty eyes, then returned to their futile attempts at engagement. Daniel stood at the window, watching the cubs for over an hour. He did not speak. He simply observed, occasionally making notes on his device. Zaithkor watched the human, trying to understand what he was seeing that the Valarni had missed. Finally, Daniel turned to the commander. "I would like to go down there," he said. "Alone, if possible. Just me and the cubs." Zaithkor's ears shot forward in alarm. "Human, that may not be safe. The cubs are unresponsive, yes, but they are still Valarni. They have claws and teeth. If they perceive you as a threat and react instinctively, you could be seriously hurt." Daniel smiled that calm smile again. "I appreciate your concern, Commander. But this is what I do. I work with children who cannot or will not communicate. I know how to be safe. Please trust me. Let me try." Zaithkor looked at Krelvar, who had returned to the observation area. The Alpha's expression was unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Let the human try," Krelvar said. "We have nothing left to lose." The training arena felt much larger when Daniel stood in it alone. The 3 Villarni instructors had left at his request, though he could see their worried faces pressed against the observation windows above. Zathakor and Krelvar stood there too, watching his every movement with a mixture of hope and skepticism. 50 cubs sat in their perfect rows before him. They ranged in age from what Daniel guessed was equivalent to 2 or 3 human years up to perhaps 5. Their fur showed beautiful patterns in browns, grays, whites, and golds. Some had spots like leopards. Others had stripes like tigers. Each one was unique and lovely, and each one sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. Daniel had seen this before, though never on this scale. He had worked with traumatized children, with kids on the autism spectrum who struggled with communication, with young people who had learned that shutting down was safer than engaging. The specifics were different, but that look in their eyes, or rather the lack of anything in their eyes, was painfully familiar. He did not approach them directly. That was the first rule he had learned years ago. Never force interaction. Instead, he walked to a spot about 15 feet away from the nearest row of cubs and simply sat down on the floor. He crossed his legs in a comfortable position and let his shoulders relax. Then he waited. Minutes passed. Daniel did not try to get the cubs' attention. He did not speak or make grand gestures. He simply sat there, occasionally shifting to get more comfortable, acting as if he were alone and perfectly content with that. Above him, he could sense the confusion from the Villarni observers. This was not what they had expected. After 10 minutes of silence, Daniel began to hum. It was a simple melody, a lullaby his mother had sung to him when he was small. The tune was soft and meandering with no particular pattern or purpose. He was not performing for the cubs. He was just humming to himself the way someone might when they were relaxed and alone. One cub's ear rotated toward him. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Daniel saw it. He continued humming, giving no sign that he had noticed the change. He pulled a small foam ball from his pocket, a stress toy he always carried, and began squeezing it idly in one hand. The foam compressed and expanded with a soft sound. Daniel watched his own hands, focusing on the simple, repetitive motion. Another ear turned his direction. Then another. The cubs were not moving otherwise, but small parts of them were beginning to track his presence. Daniel added a gentle rocking motion to his humming, swaying slightly back and forth the way humans often did when listening to music. It was not a dramatic movement, just a natural expression of being alive and present in his body. 20 minutes passed. Then something remarkable happened. A cub in the 3rd row stood up. In the observation room above, Daniel heard a sharp gasp even through the thick glass. The cub was small, a female with brown and gold fur and a lovely marbled pattern. She stood on her 4 legs, her ears pointed directly at Daniel. She took one hesitant step forward, then another. She moved slowly, carefully, as if waking from a long sleep. Daniel did not look at her directly. That was crucial. Direct eye contact could feel like a challenge or a demand. Instead, he kept his gaze on the foam ball in his hands, continuing to hum his simple tune. The cub took several more steps and then sat down about 6 feet from him, close but not touching. She folded her legs under her body in a position that mirrored his crossed legs as much as her different anatomy allowed. They sat together in silence. Daniel kept humming, kept playing with the foam ball. The cub watched his hands intently. After several minutes, Daniel slowly rolled the ball across the floor. It traveled in a gentle arc and stopped just in front of the cub's paws. The young Villarni looked down at the ball. Her head tilted slightly, an expression of curiosity. She reached out one small paw and touched the foam. It compressed under the pressure of her pad. Her ears perked up with interest. She picked up the ball, held it between her paws, and squeezed. The ball squished down, then expanded back to its original shape. The cub made a sound, a soft chirping noise that broke through the silence like a bell. Above them, Daniel knew the Villarni were probably losing their minds. It was the first sound any of them had heard from a cub in months. But he did not react with excitement or celebration. He simply smiled slightly and pulled another toy from his bag. This one was a small puzzle cube with different colored sides that could be twisted and turned. He manipulated it casually, turning the sides with soft clicking sounds. A second cub stood up. This one was larger, a male with gray and white stripes. He approached more confidently than the first, sitting down on Daniel's other side. Daniel handed him the puzzle cube without looking at him directly, continuing to hum. The male cub took the toy and immediately began trying to twist it as Daniel had done. The clicking sound seemed to fascinate him. Over the next hour, 4 more cubs approached. Daniel gave each one a different simple toy from his bag. A squishy toy shaped like a frog that squeaked when pressed. A small rubber ball that bounced in unpredictable directions. A set of smooth stones that clicked together pleasantly. He did not explain the toys. He did not instruct the cubs on how to use them. He simply demonstrated with his own hands, and the cubs watched and imitated. The 6 cubs who had joined him began to interact not just with the toys but with each other. The female with the brown and gold fur offered her foam ball to the gray and white male. He squeezed it and chirped with delight, then handed it back. Another cub, this one with black fur and silver spots, rolled her rubber ball to a neighbor. They began a simple game of rolling the ball back and forth between them. Daniel continued to hum, adding quiet words now, singing fragments of old songs from Earth. The cubs did not understand the language, but they seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice. One of them, the smallest in the group with cream-colored fur, scooted closer until she was leaning against Daniel's leg. He very gently, moving slowly so as not to startle her, placed his hand on her head and gave a soft scratch behind her ears. The cub leaned into the touch, making a purring sound deep in her throat. It was a sound of contentment, of trust, of connection. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he kept his movements calm and steady. When an hour had passed, Daniel knew he needed to leave. Pushing too far, staying too long could undo the progress. He slowly got to his feet, moving carefully so the cub leaning against him could adjust. The 6 cubs looked up at him, their eyes now showing something they had not before. Awareness, presence, life. Daniel collected his toys, giving each cub one last gentle touch on the head. As he walked toward the door, the cubs followed him. They did not want him to leave. The brown and gold female who had approached him first made a soft whining sound and very gently caught the fabric of his pants with her paw, not with claws, just with the soft pads of her foot. Daniel knelt down to her level. He spoke in English, knowing she could not understand the words, but hoping she would understand the tone. "I know, sweetheart, but I will be back tomorrow. I promise you. I am not leaving forever." He held out his hand, palm up, in a gesture of peace. The cub looked at his hand for a moment, then placed her paw in his palm. Her paw pads were soft and warm. They stayed that way for several heartbeats, human and alien, connected across the vast differences between their species by something simple and universal. Trust. Daniel gently closed his fingers around her paw in the briefest of squeezes, then released her and stood. He walked to the door without looking back, though it took all his willpower. Looking back might make them think he had changed his mind, might make the departure harder. He stepped through the door and it closed behind him. The walk back to the observation room felt long. When Daniel entered, he found himself facing a room full of stunned Villarni. Sirenelle, the female instructor he had seen earlier, had tears streaming down her furred face. Krelvar stood with his mouth slightly open, an expression of shock that probably rarely appeared on an alpha's face. Zathakor stared at Daniel as if the human had just performed an impossible miracle. "How?" Krelvar said finally, his voice rough. "How did you do that?" Daniel took a deep breath, suddenly feeling exhausted. The emotional weight of connecting with those traumatized cubs had taken more out of him than he expected. "I did not do anything special," he said. "I just showed them that I was not going to force them to do anything. I gave them a choice." "A choice?" Zathakor repeated, confused. "What choice?" "The choice to engage or not engage," Daniel explained. "The choice to approach me or stay where they were. The choice to take a toy or leave it. The choice to interact with each other or play alone. Every moment I was down there, I was offering them choices, not commands." The Villarni looked at each other, clearly not understanding. Sirenelle spoke up, her voice shaking. "But we need to teach them. We need to train them for life in the packs. How can we do that if we do not direct them, if we do not command them?" Daniel looked back through the window at the arena below. The 6 cubs who had engaged with him were still active. They were playing with the toys he had left, interacting with each other, making soft sounds. The other 44 cubs remained motionless in their rows, still shut down. But 6 was better than 0. 6 was a beginning. The meeting room was packed the next morning. Word had spread through the facility about what the human had accomplished, and instructors from all over the complex wanted to understand what had happened. Daniel stood at the front of the room with a display screen behind him, facing at least 40 Villarni educators and administrators. Zathakor and Krelvar sat in the front row, their attention fixed on him. Daniel had spent half the night preparing his presentation. He needed to explain something that was obvious to him, but completely foreign to the Villarni mindset. He needed to do it in a way that did not insult their culture or make them defensive. That was going to be the tricky part. "Thank you all for coming," Daniel began. "I know yesterday's session raised many questions. Before I explain what I did and why it worked, I need you to understand something about human children. This will help you see the comparison." He pulled up an image on the screen showing human children of various ages playing in a park. Human children go through predictable developmental stages. When they are very young, they depend completely on their parents. But around the age of 2, something changes. They begin to assert independence. They start saying no. They refuse to do things they are asked to do, even simple things they could easily accomplish. We call this the terrible twos, and it drives human parents crazy. Some of the Villarni shifted uncomfortably. Cyranelle raised her paw. "This sounds like defiance. How do humans deal with defiant cubs?" "That is exactly my point," Daniel said. "We do not see it as defiance. We see it as a necessary developmental stage. The child is not trying to be bad. They are trying to establish that they are a separate person from their parents, that they have their own will and desires. If we handle this stage correctly, the child learns healthy independence while still respecting authority. If we handle it incorrectly by forcing absolute obedience, the child either becomes rebellious or shuts down completely." He changed the image to show a graph of child development. This drive for autonomy, for having some control over their own lives, is fundamental to psychological health in humans. Children who are given age-appropriate choices grow into confident, capable adults. Children who are given no choices often develop anxiety, depression, or become unable to make decisions on their own. Krelvar leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Are you saying Villarni cubs are experiencing this terrible twos phase?" "Not exactly," Daniel said carefully, "but I believe something similar is happening. Let me show you something." He pulled up video footage from the previous day showing the various attempts to engage the cubs before his session. First, he showed Cyranelle approaching a cub and speaking to her gently. "Watch her body language and word choice," Daniel said. He played the audio with translation. "Come here, little one. It is time to learn colors. Sit up straight. Look at this object. Tell me what color it is." He paused the video. Every single sentence is a command. "Come here, sit up, look, tell me." Even though Cyranelle is being gentle and kind, she is still commanding obedience in every interaction. "Now watch this." He showed the footage of Krelvar in the arena. The mighty Alpha's commanding voice rang through the speakers. "Stand and form pairs. I am Alpha Krelvar. You will obey this command." Daniel paused it again. Absolute authority. Complete expectation of obedience. No choice given to the cubs at all. "Now let me show you what I did differently." He played footage of himself sitting on the floor humming, playing with the foam ball. "I did not command anything. I did not even ask anything. I made myself available and interesting, and then I waited. When the first cub approached me, she did so because she chose to, not because she was forced. That choice was the key." The room erupted in voices. Some Villarni were nodding thoughtfully. Others looked angry or confused. One older instructor, his fur gray with age, stood up. "This is nonsense. Villarni society is built on pack structure and hierarchy. Cubs must learn to follow their elders and respect the alpha. This is how we have survived for 10,000 years. You cannot simply throw away our entire culture." Daniel nodded respectfully. "I am not suggesting you throw away your culture. Pack structure and hierarchy are clearly important to your species. But consider this. When did this problem with the cubs begin?" Zathakor spoke up from the front row. "About 12 years ago, as we told you." "And when did the Villarni join the Galactic Council?" Daniel asked. 42 years ago, the commander replied. His ears suddenly perked up. "You think the two are connected?" Daniel changed the display to show a timeline. "I think your society has been changing rapidly since contact with other species. You have been exposed to dozens of different cultures, different ways of organizing society, different ideas about individuality and choice. Your adult Villarni have adapted to this. You work with species that do not have pack hierarchies. You negotiate with beings who value individual freedom over group cohesion, but your cub rearing practices have not changed at all. He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Your cubs are being born into a world that is fundamentally different from the one you were born into. They are growing up seeing their parents interact with aliens who make their own choices, who question authority, who value independence. But when they enter the training facilities, they are raised exactly as cubs were raised 1,000 years ago. There is a disconnect and the cubs cannot process it. Cyranelle stood up, her voice emotional. So you are saying we have broken them? That our traditional methods have damaged our own children? No, Daniel said firmly. The cubs are not broken. They are responding rationally to an impossible situation. They are being prepared for a world that no longer exists. When faced with constant commands and no autonomy, in an age where they can see autonomy all around them, they have done the only thing they could. They have shut down. Krelvar's voice was low and dangerous. Explain to me how giving cubs choices will prepare them for life in a pack. Our survival depends on cooperation, on following the alpha, on knowing one's place. If we raise cubs to make their own choices, how will they function as adults? This was the critical moment. Daniel chose his words carefully. Alpha Krelvar, may I ask you a question? When you became an alpha, was it because you were commanded to challenge for that position, or did you choose to do it? The alpha's ears went back. I chose it. I saw weakness in the previous alpha and knew I could lead better. And when you lead your pack, do you follow a script that was written for you? Or do you make decisions based on the situation? Daniel pressed. I make decisions. That is what a leader does. Exactly, Daniel said. You are a powerful, successful alpha because you developed the ability to think independently, to assess situations, to make choices. But you still function within the pack structure. You still respect the hierarchies and traditions that matter. Choice and structure are not opposites. You can have both. He turned to address the whole room. What I am suggesting is that you give cubs space to develop their sense of self during their early years. Let them play freely. Let them make small, age-appropriate choices. Let them explore and experiment in safe environments. Then, as they grow older and more mature, you guide them into understanding the pack structure and their place within it. They will embrace that structure more fully because they will choose it themselves, not because it was forced on them before they were ready. An instructor in the back raised his paw. How do we know this will work? You had success with 6 cubs out of 50. That is only 12%. You are right, Daniel admitted. This is just a beginning. But consider this. Those 6 cubs were responsive after 1 hour with me. How many months have you been trying with 0 success? I am not saying my way is perfect. I am saying it is working when your way has stopped working entirely. Zaithkor stood up, his presence commanding silence. The human makes valid points. Our methods are failing completely. We must try something different or we have no future. I am authorizing Daniel Price to train any instructors who volunteer to learn his methods. Those who do not wish to participate may continue with traditional approaches. We will see which produces results. Krelvar rose as well, and everyone turned to look at the alpha. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. I have spent 5 years watching cubs sit in silence. I have tried everything I know, used every technique passed down through generations, and I have failed. If the human's strange methods can bring our cubs back to us, then I will support this fully. Pride means nothing if we have no cubs to teach. The room fell silent. If the alpha himself was willing to accept this radical change, then others would follow. Cyranelle stood up. I volunteer to learn from Daniel. I will try anything to reach the cubs. One by one, other instructors stood. Within minutes, 15 Villarni had volunteered. They were mostly younger instructors, those who had grown up after the Villarni joined the Galactic community. But there were a few older ones too, those who had watched the cubs slip away and were desperate enough to try anything. Daniel felt a wave of relief. 15 was enough to start with. Thank you, he said. We will begin this afternoon. I am going to teach you some basic principles, and then we will practice together. But first I need to return to the arena. The training of the instructors took place in a smaller room away from the main arena. Daniel had set it up to look nothing like a traditional Villarni classroom. Instead of neat rows and designated teaching spaces, there were cushions scattered around, bins of toys and simple objects, and open areas for movement. The 15 volunteer instructors entered looking confused and uncomfortable. "This does not look like a learning environment," one of them said. His name was Torvik, and he had been teaching cubs for 20 years before the crisis began. "That is exactly the point," Daniel replied. "Sit anywhere you like. Get comfortable. This is going to be different from any training you have experienced before." The instructors slowly settled themselves around the room. Most chose to sit in a loose circle facing Daniel, but a few picked spots along the edges. Cyrano sat directly in front of him, her attention completely focused. Krelvar had also joined them, though he sat slightly apart, observing. "Let me start with a demonstration," Daniel said. "Cyrano, would you help me?" The female instructor nodded eagerly. Daniel smiled at her. "I want you to stack these blocks into a tower. Make it as tall as you can." He placed a set of colored blocks in front of her. Cyrano looked at the blocks, then at Daniel, confused, but she reached out and began stacking them carefully, her dexterous paws placing each block precisely on top of the last. She built a tower 8 blocks high before it wobbled and fell. She looked disappointed. "Now," Daniel said, "I'm going to give you the same task, but differently. Cyrano, I notice you are building with blocks. That is interesting. I wonder what would happen if you tried a different approach. There are many ways to stack things. Would you like to try again? Or would you prefer to do something else?" Cyrano thought for a moment. "I would like to try again. But this time I will make a wider base for stability." She rebuilt the tower with a broader foundation and managed to stack 10 blocks high. When she finished, she looked pleased with herself. Daniel nodded approvingly. What was different between the first time and the second time? "The first time, you commanded me to do it," Cyrano said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The second time, you observed what I was doing, offered information, and gave me a choice. I felt more invested in the outcome because it was my decision to continue." "Exactly," Daniel said. "Now imagine if you were a cub and every interaction you had all day long was like the first example. Command after command after command. How would you feel?" Torvik spoke up. "Tired, overwhelmed, like nothing I did mattered because I was just following orders." "Yes," Daniel said. "Now imagine you are a cub and most of your day is structured like the second example. You have guidance and support, but also choices and autonomy. How would that feel?" "Like I mattered," Cyrano said quietly. "Like my preferences and ideas were valued." Daniel spent the next hour teaching them the principles of what he called choice-based learning. He explained how to offer choices between acceptable options. Instead of saying, "It is time for physical training," they could say, "Would you like to practice climbing or running today?" Both activities accomplished the goal of physical development, but the cub felt ownership of the decision. He taught them how to observe and comment rather than command. Instead of "Sit up straight," they could say, "I notice you are slouching. Your back might get tired in that position." Let the cub decide what to do with that information. He showed them how to follow the cub's lead in play. If a cub showed interest in a particular toy or activity, the instructor should join in that activity rather than redirecting to a planned lesson. Learning could happen anywhere, through anything. But what about skills they must learn? One instructor asked. "There are things every Valarni needs to know. Pack dynamics, hunting techniques, social hierarchies. How do we teach those if we are just following whatever the cubs want to do?" Daniel nodded. "That is a valid concern. The answer is that you embed those lessons into activities the cubs choose. Let me give you an example. You need to teach pack coordination, correct? Instead of lining cubs up and drilling them on formation movements, create a game where they have to work together to achieve a goal, maybe moving a large object from one place to another. They will naturally organize themselves, try different strategies, learn to communicate and cooperate. They are learning the same skills, but through play and choice rather than rigid instruction." Krelvar had been silent throughout the session, but now he spoke. "This sounds very uncertain. What if the cubs make the wrong choices? What if they refuse to learn important skills?" Daniel turned to face the alpha. "That is where your role as instructor comes in. You create the environment, provide the materials, and guide through questions and observations. You are not abandoning structure entirely. You are making the structure flexible and responsive to the cubs' needs. And yes, sometimes cubs will make poor choices. That is part of learning too. They experience consequences, adjust their behavior, and grow." He pulled out his device and showed them video footage from human schools. Children working in small groups on projects, choosing between different activity stations, engaging in structured play that taught academic and social skills. This is not a new or untested approach. Humans have been refining these methods for over a century. We know they work. The training continued for 3 hours. Daniel had them practice offering choices, observing without judging, and following a child's lead. He had them role-play different scenarios, taking turns being the instructor and the cub. Some of them struggled with it, their instincts telling them to take control and direct. Others took to it naturally, their faces lighting up as they understood the possibilities. By the end of the session, all 15 instructors looked exhausted but energized. Cyrenelle approached Daniel as the others were leaving. "This is going to be hard," she said honestly. "Everything in my training, everything I have been taught about teaching goes against this approach." "I know," Daniel said gently. "You are fighting thousands of years of cultural conditioning. But you saw what happened with the cubs yesterday and today. 21 cubs are now engaged in learning. 21 out of 50 is almost half. That is remarkable progress in just 2 days. When do we start implementing this?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Daniel said. "You and the other volunteers will each take a small group of cubs. I will rotate between groups, helping you, giving feedback, supporting you through the challenges. We will figure this out together." The next morning, the training facility looked completely different. The volunteers had worked through the night to restructure their spaces. Gone were the rigid rows of seating. In their place were activity zones with different options. A climbing area with soft mats, a quiet zone with books and puzzles, an art station with materials for creating, a dramatic play area with props and costumes. Cubs could move between zones freely, choosing their activities. When the 50 cubs were brought in, they entered cautiously. The 21 who had engaged with Daniel over the past 2 days immediately went exploring, chirping with excitement as they discovered the new spaces. The other 29 sat down in a cluster, still shut down, still silent. Cyrenelle took a deep breath and approached the active cubs. She knelt down near them, watching what they were doing. Several were at the climbing structure, scrambling up and sliding down. "Wow," she said, her voice full of genuine interest. "You are climbing so high. I wonder if you can reach the top." One of the cubs, a male with black and silver stripes, looked at her and chirped. Then he turned and climbed higher, reaching the very top of the structure. He looked back at Cyrenelle with pride. She clapped her paws together. "You did it! How does it look from up there?" The cub made a longer vocalization, something that almost sounded like words. He was trying to communicate. Cyrenelle felt tears prick her eyes but kept her voice steady and encouraging. "That sounds amazing. Do you think the others can climb that high too?" The cub's challenge drew the attention of 3 other cubs who immediately rushed to the climbing structure to try. Soon they were having an impromptu competition, cheering each other on, celebrating successes. They were learning physical coordination, healthy competition, social encouragement, all through self-directed play. Meanwhile, Daniel was working with another instructor named Harvin near the quiet zone. 3 cubs were there, looking at books with pictures. Harvin started to reach for one of the books, intending to read it to them, but Daniel gently touched his arm and shook his head. Instead, they watched as the cubs looked through the books at their own pace, pointing at pictures, making sounds to each other. "It is hard not to direct them," Harvin whispered. "I know," Daniel whispered back, "but watch how much they are learning just by exploring on their own. They are developing visual literacy, learning to focus their attention, sharing resources with each other. You do not need to control every moment of learning." The morning progressed and something wonderful happened. 2 of the still silent cubs stood up and walked over to the activity zones. They had been watching the active cubs play, and curiosity had finally overcome their shutdown. One approached the art station where cubs were making colorful marks on paper. The other went to the dramatic play area where cubs were pretending to be adult Valarni on a hunting. 3 months had passed since Daniel first arrived on Valar Prime, and the transformation was remarkable. The training facility that had once been silent as a tomb now rang with the sounds of cubs playing, learning, and living. Of the original 50 cubs in complete shutdown, 48 were now fully engaged. The last 2 were making slow progress, responding sometimes but still struggling. Daniel knew they might need specialized help, possibly professional therapy for trauma. But 48 out of 50 was a success rate that exceeded even his most optimistic projections. The real victory, though, was the instructors. Cyrenelle and the other volunteers had fully embraced the new methods. They had moved past the awkward stage of fighting their instincts and now operated naturally within the choice-based framework. They still maintained structure and had expectations for the cubs, but they delivered those expectations through invitation and guidance rather than command and control. Daniel stood in the observation room watching a session led by Torvik, the instructor who had been most skeptical at the beginning. A group of 10 cubs were learning pack coordination through a game Torvik had invented. The cubs had to work together to transport water from one container to another using only small cups, competing against a timer. They had to organize themselves, assign roles, communicate effectively, and adjust their strategy when things went wrong. It was brilliant. The cubs were learning everything they needed to know about functioning in a pack, but they were doing it through play, through choices they made about how to approach the challenge. When they succeeded, their celebration was genuine. When they failed, they analyzed what went wrong and tried again. They were developing critical thinking skills alongside the pack coordination. Zethakor joined Daniel at the window. "I am told you are leaving tomorrow." "Yes," Daniel said. "You have 11 other training facilities across your planets that need help. I need to visit each one, train the instructors there, and get the process started. After that, I promised I would return to Earth. I have responsibilities there too." "We cannot thank you enough for what you have done here," the commander said formally. "You have saved our species." "That is not hyperbole. Without your intervention, we would have faced extinction within a generation." Daniel shook his head. "I did not save your species. Your instructors did that. Cyrano, Torvik, Harvin. All the volunteers who were willing to challenge everything they had been taught and try something new. They did the hard work. I just pointed them in a different direction." "You are too modest," Zethkor replied. "But I understand the sentiment. Still, the cubs here have asked to say goodbye to you. Would you be willing to visit them one last time?" Daniel smiled. "I would like nothing better." When he entered the training arena, all 50 cubs were waiting for him. Even the 2 who still struggled had been brought in for this occasion. The moment Daniel appeared, the cubs rushed toward him in a wave of fur and chirping voices. He laughed as they surrounded him, each one wanting his attention, his touch, his acknowledgement. He sat down on the floor and let them climb on him, pet him, show him things they had made or learned. The little female with brown and gold fur, the first one who had approached him all those months ago, stayed close by his side. She had grown in the past 3 months, her colors deepening, her confidence blooming. She would be a remarkable adult someday. Daniel pulled out his bag and distributed his collection of Earth toys one final time. He had brought more over the months, and now each cub had a favorite. The foam balls, puzzle cubes, squishy frogs, all of them were treasured possessions. But more than the toys, Daniel knew he had given them something more valuable. He had given them back their voices, their curiosity, their sense of self. Cyrano and the other instructors watched from the side, giving Daniel this time with the cubs. When he finally stood to leave, the cubs did not try to stop him this time. They had learned over the months that he always came back when he said he would, and that goodbye did not mean forever. The brown and gold female walked with him to the door, placed her paw in his hand one last time, and chirped softly. Daniel knelt down and spoke to her in English, as he always did. "You are going to do amazing things, sweetheart. You are brave and curious and kind. Do not let anyone tell you that those qualities are not valuable in a pack member. The Valarni need people like you," she chirped again, and though he could not understand her language, he felt like she was saying goodbye and thank you all at once. The tour of the other training facilities took 2 months. Each one faced the same crisis, and each one required the same solution. Daniel trained instructors, set up play-based environments, and watched as silent cubs slowly came back to life. Some facilities adapted quickly, others struggled with cultural resistance. But by the end of his time with the Valarni, every facility had at least a core group of instructors implementing the new methods, and engagement rates among the cubs were climbing steadily. The Galactic Council invitation came during his last week on the final Valarni world. They wanted him to present his findings at a special session, attended by representatives from 30 species, many of whom were facing similar crises with their young. Daniel agreed, though the thought of speaking to such a large, diverse audience made him nervous. The council chambers were impressive, a massive circular room with seating areas for each species, designed to accommodate a wide variety of body types and environmental needs. Daniel stood at the center podium, looking up at hundreds of alien faces watching him with interest and skepticism. He started with the Villarni case study, showing before and after footage of the cubs. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Silent, shut-down cubs in the before footage. Active, engaged, joyful cubs in the after footage. The council members murmured among themselves, clearly impressed. Then Daniel shifted to explaining the principles behind the transformation. He talked about autonomy and choice, about the developmental need for agency, about how rapidly changing societies required flexible, adaptive approaches to raising children. He emphasized that these methods did not mean abandoning cultural values or structure, but rather adapting those structures to serve the children better. A representative from a species called the Torthani stood up. They were insectoid beings with a hive-based society. Your methods seem focused on individuality. The Torthani clicked through a translator. Our species values the collective above all else. How would your approach work for us? Daniel considered the question carefully. The need for autonomy exists even within collective societies. Think about it this way. A healthy hive needs workers who can solve problems, adapt to changing situations, and make decisions when the hive mind is not directly controlling them. If you raise your young with some degree of choice and agency, they will develop those problem-solving skills and adaptability. They will still serve the hive, but they will do so more effectively because they have learned to think for themselves when necessary. The Torthani seemed to consider this, then sat back down. Other questions followed. Some representatives were enthusiastic, already seeing how these principles could help their own struggling youth programs. Others were resistant, defending their traditional methods. Daniel answered each question as best he could, always emphasizing that he was not telling anyone to abandon their culture, only to adapt it for their children's developmental needs. At the end of the session, 12 species officially requested that Daniel visit their worlds to consult on their youth programs. He had to politely decline most of them. I am one person, he explained. I cannot be everywhere. But what I can do is train others. Send representatives to study with me. Learn these principles and adapt them to your own species. Then return home and teach your educators. That is how real change happens. Not through one person trying to fix everything, but through knowledge spreading and people working together. The council agreed to establish an interspecies exchange program focused on child development. Species would share their successful methods, learn from each other, and adapt approaches to fit their unique needs. It was exactly what Daniel had hoped for. Not a single solution imposed from outside, but a collaborative effort to help children across the galaxy. Finally, after 5 months away from Earth, Daniel boarded a transport heading home. As the ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, he thought about everything that had happened. He had left Earth as a relatively unknown consultant working with a handful of troubled kids. He was returning as someone who had helped save an entire species and started a galaxy-wide conversation about child development. But the thing he was most proud of was not the grand outcomes. It was the small moments. The first chirp from a silent cub, the look of understanding in an instructor's eyes when they finally got it. The sight of children playing freely, making choices, developing into whoever they were meant to be. When he arrived back on Earth, Daniel took a few days to settle in before returning to his regular work. His small consulting office looked exactly as he had left it, though his email inbox was overflowing. Word of his success with the Villarni had reached Earth, and dozens of schools and institutions wanted to work with him.